He pulled over for a sip of coffee on a lonely snow-covered road. But what Harold saw next would change not just his day, but his life. 2 freezing puppies, tied to a wooden stake, abandoned in the middle of a blizzard. And someone was watching from the woods. What happened next will warm your heart and chill your spine at the same time. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's jump into the story. The wind carried a sharp bite as it swept across the snowy hills of northern Yukon. Trees stood like frozen statues under a gray sky, and the road cutting through the woods was silent. No cars, no footprints, just white stillness. The kind of place where time felt paused and the world seemed to forget anyone was there. Harold Marsh, 68, was used to quiet. Since his wife passed 2 winters ago, silence had been his closest companion, along with Benny, his old golden retriever. That morning, Harold had driven his old pickup truck deep into the backcountry to check on the hunting cabin he and his wife used to visit. It was more for the memories than any real purpose. The roof still leaked, the woodpile was nearly gone, but it was a place that reminded him of love, of laughter, of a time when life still felt full. He sat behind the wheel now parked just off the side of the snow-covered road, sipping coffee from a steel thermos. Benny lay in the back seat snoring softly. Outside, the wind stirred snow like smoke across the ground. Harold leaned back, watching the treetops sway. Then, far down the road, something strange happened. A red pickup came into view, moving too fast for such icy roads. It slowed sharply and pulled over about 100 yards ahead. Harold watched with a frown. A man stepped out quickly from the passenger side, carrying something, small dark shapes tucked under each arm. He moved to the edge of the ditch, bent down, and in less than a minute was back in the truck. The door slammed. The red pickup sped off without a glance back. Harold narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. He waited a few seconds, then turned to Benny. "Stay here, boy," he said, though Benny was already awake, ears up. Stepping into the snow, Harold pulled his coat tight and made his way toward the spot where the man had stopped. The cold bit at his cheeks and the wind howled softly through the trees. At first he saw nothing, just a pile of fresh snow, a broken piece of wood sticking out, and he froze. There, barely visible under the blowing snow, were 2 tiny puppies. One was lying down, barely breathing. The other was sitting up, trembling so hard its whole body shook. Both were tied to a broken tent stake driven into the ground. The rope dug deep into their fur. One of them had blood on its paw. The other looked too weak to even lift its head. They didn't bark, they didn't whine, they just looked at him with wide, silent eyes. "Oh no," Harold whispered, his heart tightening. Dear God. He dropped to his knees, his fingers stiff, from cold as he struggled with the knots. The rope was frozen, hard as wire. The puppies didn't resist. They let him touch them, pick them up, as if they knew there was no fight left to give. He wrapped them in his coat, pressing them against his chest. They were ice cold, so small, so quiet. Harold rushed back to the truck, snow stinging his face. Benny moved aside without a word, sniffing the pups, then curling protectively around them as Harold started the engine. The heater blasted, but it would take time to warm the air inside. Harold looked in the rearview mirror. Snow was picking up. The wind had turned angry. A storm was coming, and fast. He had 2 choices: drive 60 miles back to town, through winding, icy roads, or go to the cabin. He glanced at the puppies now wrapped together on the passenger seat and at Benny, whose eyes were locked on him. "Hold on," Harold muttered, and shifted the truck into gear. The road to the cabin was narrow, barely visible, now under the falling snow. The tires slipped. The engine groaned. But Harold pressed forward, guided by memory more than sight. Trees closed in around him. The sky darkened. It felt like the world was holding its breath. At last, the cabin appeared, like a ghost rising from the snow. It leaned slightly, weathered and worn, but it stood. 4 walls, a fireplace, shelter. Harold parked the truck, grabbed the bundled pups and pushed open the creaky front door. Cold air rushed out. Dust covered everything, but he didn't care. He set the pups down gently on a faded rug and moved, fast, tossing logs into the fireplace, striking a match, lighting the fire. Warmth came slowly, but it came. As the fire crackled to life, Harold wrapped the puppies in old towels. One twitched. The other whimpered softly. Benny lay beside them again, sharing his warmth without a sound. Outside, the wind screamed louder. Inside, the glow of the fire danced across Harold's face as he looked down at the tiny lives now in his care. And though he didn't know what came next, he knew one thing for sure. These puppies were not going to die tonight. The fire crackled inside the old hunting cabin, slowly pushing back the cold that had settled into the walls over years of silence. Snow pounded the roof in steady waves, the wind outside howling like a distant warning. Inside, though, a small warmth had returned, not just in the room, but in Harold's chest. The two puppies lay wrapped in flannel towels near the hearth, their little bodies pressed close together. One of them, the larger of the two, had started to twitch its nose. It licked its lips once, then curled up tighter. The smaller one, though, still didn't move. Harold sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, watching them closely. His hands, stiff, from the cold and age, held a metal pot over the fire. Inside, he warmed a mix of powdered milk and a small spoon of honey. He wasn't sure it was the right thing to do, but it was all he had. "Just hang in there," he whispered, more to himself than to the pups. Benny, his old retriever, lay quietly beside them, his head resting on his paws, eyes alert but gentle. Every now and then, he'd sniff the smaller puppy and give it a slow, soft lick. Harold took a rag from the corner and dipped it into the warm milk. He squeezed out the excess, then gently pressed it to the mouth of the stronger pup. The little one twitched, then licked it weakly. "There we go," Harold said, his voice cracking a little. The cabin hadn't seen life like this in years. It had once been filled with laughter, campfire stories, and the smell of baked beans and roasted fish. Now it smelled of wet fur and wood smoke. But to Harold it was the best scent he'd known in a long time. As the hours passed, he rotated the puppies close to the fire, checking their breathing, rubbing their small bodies to keep their blood moving. The stronger one began to lift its head now and then. The other, still no sound. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow pushed against the windows. The wind knocked branches across the roof. But Harold didn't hear it anymore. His focus was entirely on these two small, helpless creatures who had, somehow, found their way into his life. Memories began to creep in with the quiet. He saw his wife again, Marlene, crouching by this same fireplace, laughing as Benny, back then just a pup himself, dragged a blanket across the floor. He could still hear her voice, soft and warm, telling him to add more cinnamon to the cocoa. That was 10 years ago, but it felt like yesterday now. Harold blinked, eyes misting. "You'd have loved these two," he said softly, looking down at the puppies. "They've got fight, just like you did." He reached for a pencil and tore a page from an old notebook resting on a nearby shelf. He began to write, not much, just a few lines. Two pups found in the snow, one strong, one fading, giving them warmth, milk, and hope. "I think it's working." He left the paper folded by the hearth, a record maybe, or something for someone, to find if the storm got worse. Near midnight, Harold stood and stretched. His knees cracked loudly and Benny huffed at the noise. Harold gave him a small smile and patted his side. "Still with me, boy?" Benny wagged his tail once. Harold pulled a wool blanket around his shoulders and sat down again, closer this time. He dipped the rag once more and pressed it to the lips of the smaller puppy. No response. He tried again. This time, the pup gave a tiny, soft movement. A flick of the tongue. Harold's breath caught in his throat. "That's it," he said, quietly. "You're still with us." He kept feeding them through the night every hour, just a little at a time. The stronger one soon stood on wobbly legs, sniffed Benny, then curled back up. The smaller one didn't stand yet, but it moved more. Its breathing was steadier now. By dawn, both were alive. Weak, but alive. Harold leaned back against the wall, watching the light creep in through the frosted window panes. His eyes were heavy, his body aching, but his heart was full. He whispered something to himself, something he hadn't said in a long time. "Thank you." Just then, Benny lifted his head and gave a low growl. It wasn't loud, just a sound of warning. Harold sat up straight. "What is it?" Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind still whispered through the trees. And there, not far from the cabin, were the tracks of a vehicle. Fresh ones. Then came the sound, tires crunching over snow. A truck. Harold stepped toward the door, his hand on the old hunting rifle leaning beside the frame. Benny stood beside him now, tail low, ears perked. The puppies slept on, unaware. Outside, a white pickup pulled into view. Two men got out, one with a thick coat and another with a rifle slung over his shoulder. They walked toward the cabin slowly. Harold took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and whispered to Benny, "Stay ready, boy." The snow outside the cabin lay in thick, untouched piles, glowing pale under the morning sky. The fire inside had died down to glowing embers, but warmth still filled the room. The puppies were asleep, their tiny chests rising and falling gently. Benny lay nearby, his eyes half open, ears alert. Harold stood at the door, heart thudding in his chest. The white pickup had stopped just beyond the tree line, its engine rumbling low. Two men stepped out slowly. One wore a thick camo jacket and heavy boots. The other, taller and leaner, held a rifle casually in one hand like it was just another tool. They moved without urgency but with clear purpose, heading straight for the cabin. Harold watched them through a gap in the curtain, his breath misting the cold glass. He didn't know who they were, but something about their slow, steady walk didn't feel friendly. Benny gave a low growl. "Easy, boy," Harold whispered. He patted Benny's head, but he didn't feel easy at all. A knock came, sharp, loud, and impatient. Harold opened the door halfway, blocking the view inside with his body. "Morning," he said calmly, though his voice carried an edge. The man in the camo jacket, the older one, maybe in his 40s, gave a short nod. "Morning, cold one out here?" "Sure is." The man looked past Harold's shoulder, trying to see inside. "We're looking for a couple pups, black and tan little ones. Belong to a friend of ours. He lost 'em up this way." Harold didn't blink. "Haven't seen any dogs but my own," he replied. Benny barked once from behind him, as if to say, "I'm the only one here." The younger man stayed quiet, but his eyes were sharp. He glanced at the snow-covered truck, at the old sled leaning against the cabin wall, and at the smoke rising faintly from the chimney. "Mind if we take a quick look around?" the older man asked, a polite smile on his face but no warmth in his tone. Harold didn't move. "Afraid I do mind. You see, this is private land. Old family cabin. No dogs here but mine, and no reason for visitors, especially armed ones." The man with the rifle shifted slightly, his fingers tapping the barrel. "We're not looking for trouble, mister, just the pups." Harold stepped out just enough to make his stance firm. "They're not yours," he said quietly. "Not anymore." There was a long pause. The men looked at each other. Something passed between them. A decision, maybe. Then, without a word, they turned back toward the truck. Harold didn't relax until the engine roared to life and the pickup rolled slowly away, disappearing into the trees. He closed the door gently, then bolted it. Benny wagged his tail, proud. Harold gave him a pat. "Good boy, that's one storm past." He walked back to the fire and added more wood. The flames jumped quickly, bringing warmth with them. The puppies stirred, one stretching, the other letting out a small yawn. Harold knelt beside them, his hands gentle as he checked their paws, still raw but healing. "You two really caused a stir," he whispered. "But don't worry, I'm not letting anyone take you." He poured fresh water into a shallow bowl and watched as the stronger pup drank greedily. The smaller one followed, still slower, but stronger than yesterday. That afternoon, the sky darkened again. Another storm was rolling in. Heavy snow, the radio had warned the day before. Harold checked the windows, the door, and stacked more firewood beside the hearth. He boiled more milk, mixing in honey, and fed the pups every couple of hours. The cabin became a quiet rhythm. Feed, warm, rest, repeat. Outside, the storm struck hard. Snow blasted against the windows. Trees groaned in the wind. But inside, it was safe. It was warm. Harold found himself talking more than usual. To Benny, to the pups, even to the fire. "You know," he said one evening, watching the flames dance, "I haven't felt this useful in a long time. You boys showed up just when I needed something to care for again." Benny rested his head on Harold's knee. The pups curled together beside him, finally fast asleep without shivering. Then, just after midnight, something changed. A gust of wind rattled the cabin. But it wasn't the noise that caught Harold's attention. It was Benny. The old dog stood up suddenly, ears perked, staring at the window. His tail didn't wag. He let out a low, uncertain growl. Harold followed his gaze. Something moved outside. A shape in the shadows. He stepped to the window, heart thumping again. There, just beyond the trees, stood a large dog, not wild, not frightened. Watching. She had the same black and tan coloring as the pups. Her ribs were showing. Her eyes were sharp but not threatening. She didn't bark. She didn't approach, she simply watched. Harold stared back. "I think that's your mom," he whispered to the puppies, though they were still asleep. He didn't know what she wanted yet, but something in her eyes said she wasn't here, by accident. The storm outside raged on, but inside a strange calm filled the room. Something was coming. Something important. The storm outside had quieted by morning. The wind no longer screamed through the trees and the snow had softened into a slow, gentle fall, but Harold had barely slept. All night he had checked the window again and again. The large dog, the one he believed was the puppy's mother, had stayed just at the edge of the woods. She never barked, never growled. She simply watched, waiting. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned low. The puppies lay curled up, between Benny and the hearth, warm and safe. Their tiny bellies rose and fell steadily now. They had gained strength in just 2 days, and Harold could feel it. They were getting better. But something inside him felt heavier than before. Strange ache. He couldn't quite explain it. He looked out the window once more. She was still there. Thin, tired, but standing tall. "She's not going to leave, is she?" Harold said quietly to Benny, who stood beside him, tail still, ears tilted. She came for them. He turned back toward the sleeping pups. One of them lifted its head, blinking slowly. The other yawned, tiny and wide-eyed. Harold knelt down. "You're hers," he whispered. "You were never meant to stay here forever." His fingers stroked their soft fur. He had given them warmth, safety, and care, and in return they'd filled a space in his heart he didn't know was still open. But now came the hard part. Letting go. He stood slowly and opened the cabin door. Cold air rushed in, waking the pups. They stirred, and the stronger one gave a soft, curious whine. Outside, the mother dog stepped forward. No fear in her eyes, no rush, just quiet understanding. The stronger pup rose to its feet, shaky but determined, and padded to the door. The smaller one followed close behind. Harold didn't speak. He didn't call to them. He simply stepped aside. The mother walked forward, nose low, sniffing the air. She entered the cabin slowly, carefully, and then paused in front of the pups. She licked their faces gently, one by one, then curled her body around them. They buried their noses into her fur, as if they'd always known where to find her. Harold watched in silence, his chest tight, his eyes burning. She didn't give up on them, he said softly to Benny. All this time she was looking. Benny leaned into Harold's leg, tail flicking once. The mother dog stayed just a little while longer. She looked around the cabin once, her eyes meeting Harold's, for a brief moment. It was as if she knew, as if she was saying thank you, without a single sound. Then she stood, turned, and walked to the door. The puppies followed. Halfway across the snowy clearing, one of the pups stopped and turned around. It looked right at Harold, just for a moment. Then, it trotted after its mother, disappearing into the trees. Harold stood in the doorway for a long time. The wind had picked up again, brushing snow into gentle swirls. But he didn't feel the cold. Not yet. He closed the door quietly behind him. Inside, the fire still flickered. Benny walked over to his usual spot and lay down, resting his head with a soft sigh. Harold sat back in his chair, the one with the worn armrests and faded cushion. His hands rested on his knees. "We did good, boy," he said, his voice low. "We really did." He stared into the flames. It was strange. He had just let go of something, but somehow he felt fuller, not emptier. For the first time in a long while, Harold felt peace. A few weeks passed. Winter began to loosen its grip. The trees looked less heavy. The mornings didn't bite as sharply. The world was beginning to move again. Harold had returned to town once or twice for supplies, but stayed mostly at the cabin. It felt different now, warmer, even when the fire was out. One early spring morning, he and Benny took a walk down the trail behind the cabin. Snow still covered most of the ground, but patches of brown earth had begun to show. As they turned a corner near the creek, something caught Harold's eye. There, sitting on an old tree stump, was a small piece of wood. It looked like driftwood, smoothed and shaped by time, but it had been carved. Just a simple heart, nothing fancy, but clearly made by hand. Beside it were two tiny paw prints in the soft mud. Fresh. Harold stared at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I'll be," he said with a soft laugh. "They made it." Benny wagged his tail and gave a quiet bark. Harold picked up the carved heart and held it in his palm. He didn't know how it got there. Maybe someone else had found them and helped. Maybe fate had done the rest. But he believed, deep down, that it was meant for him. He looked out at the trees, the same woods that once held only silence and loss. Now, they held something else. Hope.